Started. Thanks for joining us. Most of you know who I am, Tony Gway, remote sensing specialist with the Wheatland lab. And this afternoon, very fortunate to have Dr. Andrew Hudak with us for today's seminar. Dr. Hudak earned his degrees in ecology from the University of Minnesota, a bachelor's in 1990, and then a PhD from the University of Colorado in 1999. Between degrees, he traveled and taught secondary school science in the U.S. Peace Corps in Malawi from 90 to 92. Then in 1999, he began working for the U.S. Forest Service as a postdoctoral research ecologist with the Pacific Northwest Research Station. Since 2001, he has worked as a research forester with the Rocky Mountain Research Station. He currently studies biophysical relationships between field and remotely sensed data collected at landscape to regional scales. This includes upscaling project level above ground biomass carbon estimates across the northwestern U.S. from airborne Lidar and annual Landsat time series. This also includes predicting fuel and carbon loads from 3D point cloud metrics at multiple scales, and relating fuel consumption to energy flux and fire effects. He recently completed a project tracking long-term vegetation recovery at 15 wildfires across the U.S. West and interior Alaska. Projects that bridge the scaling gap in both space and time between field and remote sensing data, where value is added to both are of greatest interest. Let's welcome Dr. Hudak.
Thank you. And remember sending you that much. That's great. So thank you, Tony, for the invitation, and Dan for getting me out here for this talk. I've been looking forward to this. I've not been to Maine before, or even New England, my first time. So it's one region of the country I've not been to. And it kind of reminds me of home. I'm from northern Minnesota, so it looks actually pretty familiar out there to me for this time of year. So today I'm going to describe for you a NASA project I've been working on for, I guess, the last 4 years. We're finishing it up, and I'll be going over some of the results of that project with you today. First, I want to ask if anyone here was in Edmonton in early October. Oh, great. This is pretty similar to the talk I gave there, where, at least in the format of the talk, I've updated the results with what I'm calling the final results. I really hope they're final now. All right. So 2 objectives I'm going to focus on today to keep it simple and streamlined, I hope. First of all, mapping current above ground biomass carbon stores across the Pacific Northwest study area from 2000 through 2016. And then the second objective I'll get into later will be projecting future above ground biomass carbon stores for 100 years. And we're doing that with the Forest Vegetation Simulator. We're doing it while accounting for disturbance trajectories and expected climate trajectories. So this is the study area. We had originally proposed the 3 states of Washington, Oregon, and Idaho. I'm still not quite sure if Idaho is considered part of the Pacific Northwest. So I've been calling it Northwestern USA. And then we threw in, more recently, Western Montana, just because we had the Landsat scenes to cover it and some LiDAR data. So this is our study area. We have been for a long time pursuing this approach of a model on the west side of the Cascades to predict biomass and one on the east side, because conditions are so different. More recently, we've now generalized across the whole area. But the approach, more fundamentally, is this is a stakeholder-driven project. So stakeholders have contributed LiDAR and plot data sets from this whole study area. And the, I guess, magenta field plot symbols up there, that shows where we're using field plot data that was collected in conjunction with LiDAR collections. The blue polygons are where LiDAR's been collected. You can see that Oregon is in the lead, and actually it's even more than this map indicates. Idaho is sort of lagging behind, But even though there's not as much coverage, there's actually a nice distribution of LiDAR collections across the different forest types in Idaho. So we're getting a good sample of the conditions that are out there. And this is what got me thinking, how can we make better use of all this data that's been collected? Because we know there's many papers we can cite showing how well we can map biomass with LiDAR. And many of these LiDAR collections are, because they're project driven, a national forest or whomever, an Indian tribe or private company, they want to do forestry applications, so they go out and collect plot data too. And they usually follow a random stratified sampling design. How can we also make use of all that plot data that's just in all these different places with all these different stakeholders? So this is a very bottom-up project where people have contributed these data sets. And my assumption is that all this, while it doesn't give complete coverage, it gives us a nice sample of the conditions that exist across the region with which to kind of base our models on. So this is the key assumption of this project, is that this is a biased sample. They're not evenly spatially distributed. We didn't do an a priori sampling design to choose where these plots are. We're just taking everything we can get and making this database from it to drive our carbon monitoring system by this approach. So here again is the study area. This is actually a more recent map of a more current map of LiDAR coverages. You can see there's even more in Oregon, but more elsewhere as well. And most people who have done above ground biomass mapping at this scale have utilized FIA plot data. And I can show you the distribution of that data. Boom, it's all over, right? Of course, they don't measure every tree. You know, this is just the plot symbols overlapping, but it's a beautiful sample. And this is broadly considered an unbiased sample of the conditions that are out there. And it's not, of course, it's not just this region, it's national. So that's usually the go-to data set for this sort of biomass carbon mapping. I wanted to try something different with these contributed data sets. What I find difficult about FIA data, well, first of all, it's hard to get the locations. And I got them. I mean, I signed the memo, so I can use those locations, but that doesn't, there's actually more problems than just that. So here's an FIA plot layout, and you've seen this before, I'm sure, with 4 subplots comprising that. And then most approaches try to, you know, train a Landsat model with these data. But it's really putting square pegs in round holes, if you know what I mean. So this is a for scale depiction of, say, a Landsat flyover and where the pixels are. And you never have a nice, tidy nesting of a plot within a single pixel. It's always spanning 2 or 3 or even 4 different pixels. You got different pixels represented in the different subplots, which is a good thing, right? But it's still a mismatch in terms of the plot footprint and the signal that Landsat's detecting. But meanwhile, we have all this LiDAR data, which you can bin arbitrarily to the plot footprint or to the Landsat pixels. So it's like the ideal sort of data to bridge that scaling gap between the tree measurements we collect within the plots and the Landsat spectral signature. So that's the underlying idea of this approach. Another issue, though, is that forest, this is all, so there are forested areas, there's non-forested areas, and you know, they're every different shape and size. And so even the FIA plot footprints aren't exclusively within just forest or just non-forest. So that gets very messy too. And a lot of the noise you see, I think, with using FIA plot data to train models has to do with this issue. And typically, when an FIA plot has more than one condition class, is what they're called, we just throw them out because it's just too difficult to overcome these edge issues. So there's a lot of FIA plots that aren't very useful But on the other hand, there's a lot of FIA plots, which is great. So what I'm doing in this project is using the FIA plot data, but only for validation. So I'm using the contributed plot data for our model development. And when we get our predictions, we get our map predictions by this approach, we are summarizing the maps at the county level to compare to FIA. This circumvents the issues with the square pegs and round holes and the secret plot location issue. We're just going to summarize at the county level, which is available publicly and it's available on an annual time step. So we want a CMS that uses what anyone can access with FIA data. Okay. The other assumption underlying our approach is that we can transfer our estimates from where we have field plot and LiDAR data to where we only have the LiDAR. So that involves both transferring across both space and time. So we've got 2 papers now published that justify this approach. The first one was now back in 2015, the temporal transferability. This is Moscow Mountain, close to where I live, just northeast of Moscow. Done a number of studies there. We have 2 LiDAR collections that have been collected there, one back in 2003 and then later in 2009, and it's going to be flown again this coming summer. The broader outline there is the earlier collection, and then the more restricted one is the 2009. And in those same years, we went out and remeasured the plots associated with each of those LiDAR collections. So we have 2 independent data sets of both field and LiDAR from which we can make maps of biomass. So what we did is just, well, if we use the 2003 field plot and LiDAR data and then build a model and then apply the model to the 2009 LiDAR, how does that compare to what we mapped when we used the 2009 field and LiDAR? And vice versa. And then what if we just pool all the data together? Well, it turns out that's the best answer, or the best approach. Pool all the plot data from both the initial measurements and the remeasurements, build a model, and then apply it to both the 2003 and the 2009. So you get you double your plot sample size, and you get a broader distribution of conditions that develop your model. That's what we found works best. Now, the idea of spatial transferability is, well, there's areas out there that have both LiDAR and field data, but often LiDAR is collected without field plot data. So how well can we then take the model that we build where we have both and apply it to where we only have LiDAR? So we did this study, published just more recently, by, okay, well, for these 6 LiDAR collections, we have both. What if we pulled out, for example, the plots from the St. Joe and base the model on the other 5 areas? Build a model, run it, apply it to the St. Joe LiDAR, and then compare that result to the generalized model where we had all the plot data available. And we did that 6 times for each 6 area, for all 6 areas. So we have predictions to compare that were included the plot data from that particular area and that didn't. Well, it works. I mean, like with the temporal transferability, you do a little bit worse than if you've got data from the right place and time, but it's still acceptable. It still leads you to the same conclusion, just a little bit less accurate. So it's a viable approach, and it's very practical because managers, they need an estimate. So if they can't afford to go and collect field plot data, they can still generate estimates based on the available data. So the idea here is a living database where whenever a new project is done, they fly the LiDAR, they collect field plot data, we add those observations to this living database. So it's important to remember that it's not just the tree measurements, it's also the LiDAR measurements associated with those tree measurements at that place and time. So that's what comprises the reference data set. And these are just some example structural conditions from the forest, the stand visualization system of the forest vegetation simulator. And then the graphs show the height profile from LiDAR returns, different structural signatures. And so the intention is to, with all this plot data we're pulling together, we're representing all the diversity of forest conditions that are out there in terms of structure and even composition. So as more project areas get done, we just keep adding to this database. And even the older data don't become less relevant, because even though conditions change for a given place through time, it's going to become more similar to some other plot that you sampled somewhere else, right? So it's still valuable data as long as you consistently process the LiDAR so that your LiDAR reference data are essentially linked to the condition that the forest was in when you sampled the trees in the ground, concurrent with the LiDAR. Okay, so back to this first objective, I'm going to transition to results now, or I mean not results, but our approach here. Oh, I hope that goes away. Yeah, I did. So this is the LiDAR point cloud at the scale of a typical forest inventory plot, 400 meters squared. Why is it not advancing?
You just have to click it again because you clicked off them.
There we go. So we got tree measurements within the plots that we're aggregating to a plot level estimate because we're using an area-based modeling approach. And then we're going to associate with that with the LiDAR to predict biomass at the landscape scale. And then once we have biomass mapped from the LiDAR, we're going to randomly choose some of those mapped pixels. So predicted biomass values to train the regional model that's driven by Landsat data primarily, but also climate metrics. So by using Landsat time series, we'll be able to map on an annual time step. And then climate metrics are important because particularly in the Pacific Northwest, they capture these huge environmental gradients very well that contribute to forest productivity. We're using the forest vegetation simulator, as I mentioned, to summarize the tree measurements at the plot level. And that also feeds into our future projections that I'll get into later. And then for the predictive modeling, we're using random forest to predict both at the landscape scale from the airborne LiDAR, and then using that random draw pixels from the LiDAR derived maps to train the Landsat driven model. Again, we're using random forest to then produce wall-to-wall maps across the study area. That's the approach. And just to make a comment about Landtrender, if you haven't heard of it, it's one of several different time series analysis methods out there developed by Robert Kennedy. This is one of his older graphics, and this sort of deck of playing cards represents annual Landsat scenes that capture the conditions in the scene. It's been used to capture disturbance trajectories. So there's, the wobbly line is the spectral signal, but then when you get a big change, that's because of a disturbance, and the algorithm detects those bigger changes and assigns a vertex where those inflection points occur. And then from those points, it can measure, it'll extract the time of disturbance, the magnitude of disturbance, and then also you can look at recovery afterwards. So you can look at the amount of vertical change here, the magnitude of recovery, and also the duration of recovery. So this is from a thin forest. Here's something more dramatic, a clear cut. And Here's an earlier thinning that wasn't as dramatic. So that's the idea behind Landtrender. Okay, now I'm moving on to results. So from the landscape level model, using Lidar model predictors primarily, but we also provided climate metrics and topographic metrics as potential candidates. These are the selected variables for this model. And now this is based on something like over 3,500 field plots in the contributed data sets. So they're sorted with the most important predictors on top. The most important was mean canopy height from the Lidar. The next most important was canopy density in an overstory stratum of 32 to 48 meters above ground. But look how many other density metrics got selected here. The density metrics are really nice because they really give you a component of the variation that tends to be unique. If you look at the correlation matrix between them, they're not highly correlated like the height percentiles are. So they serve as really nice predictor variables. We got some climate metrics in here. There's mean annual precip. There's minimum temperature, coldest month. And then kind of less important are some of the topographic predictors. So these are the ones selected for our final model. And now in the wall-to-wall model, based on the Landtrender metrics and climate variables, it was interesting how much more important the climate variables were. Mean annual precip was at the top, maximum temp in the warmest month. Then we have a topographic metric that's sensitive to the variability from aspect. North-facing slopes have very different forest structure and composition from south-facing slopes. So that captures that idea. And then down here are the Landtrender metrics, the tassel cat metrics, both as they are, but then also delta values from one year to the next. We also included those. And that captures some of the disturbance dynamics. And I think the reason these are less important is because even though there's lots of disturbance going on in Pacific Northwest, it still tends to be more localized. So at the regional scale, it's the climate variables that are really driving about, the biomass that's out there. Oh, and then because Landsat is so bad at predicting or so insensitive to canopy height, we put in the global canopy height product of Mark Simard. That's based on glass data integrated with SRTM. And so that, as I had hoped, was important. That gives us some height information. But it's kind of nominally at about 2009. So the farther away in time you are from that date, the less or the more noisy that would be. Okay, here are scatter plots of both models. So now we are just generalizing across the whole study area after having gone east versus west for a while. So on the left is the Lidar model, predicted on the X, observed on the Y. And there's quite a bit of scatter. This is a big area, but holds pretty close to the 1-to-1 line. And for some reason I didn't get bias included on this one. The Landsat models, so taking those maps, taking a random pixel draw of, I think it's maybe 10,000 pixels, and using that to train this model. This is the scatter plot, and we have a little bit of an over-prediction bias. I'm more concerned about bias because we're starting with a biased sample. So I'm acknowledging up front that these could be biased estimates. Okay, here's the maps. It's actually running through the maps right now. This is the most boring animation you'll ever see. But it's starting in 2000 and it's just stepping through each year 1 second at a time. And you have to really look carefully to see where like fires occur or big disturbance events. Because they're barely noticeable. Okay, it's over. Isn't that great? So those are the maps we're generating and we're going to put on the archive for public availability. Or I shouldn't even say are generating. They're generated now. We're done. You can see the high biomass west of the Cascades. More of that in the mountains of Idaho, where it actually gets into the coastal forest types. But a lot of non-forest too. There's a lot of rangeland out there. We're still wondering what we can do, or what we can say about that.
Is it okay to interrupt?
Yeah.
2 questions, quick. When did that map start? I didn't see. What year?
It was 2000.
2000.
But there's no reason why we couldn't go back further in time to like 84 when the TM record started.
Maybe if we watch it again. I was looking for the biscuit fire. But the other question was, did you mask this for forest first? Are you just modeling the forest, or did you model everything?
It's masked. Thank you.
Okay.
I was going to get into that. Okay, here's 2000. I'll start it again. When was it? 2003?
Thanks. Yeah.
Okay, pay attention.
Very bottom left hand.
Here we go.
Oh, yeah, there it was.
Yeah. Yeah.
Thank you.
But because we're using climate predictors, some of those big disturbance events look a little bit more muted, or like that's why I think they look more muted. So there's trade-offs. There's trade-offs to using climate metrics that aren't going to capture that. But there's advantages too, which I'm going to get into. Well, one advantage is we're actually over-predicting biomass. Our predictions are higher than FIA estimated. So observations on the y-axis of those scatter plots, that's FIA, right? For the Landsat model. For the Lidar model, the observations were the field plots that we used to train the model. So we're getting higher predictions than FIA, which is opposite what I would suspect or expect because of the age-old saturation problem with Landsat. I would have expected we'd be under-predicting, but we're not. And I think it has to do with the mask. We're using PALSAR is our forest mask. And we've looked at different PALSAR masks, and we've looked at some other masks that are spectrally derived, but we're consistently overestimating by about 20%. So here's terabytes of carbon aggregated to the county level. Of course, bigger counties will have more carbon, all else being equal. But then also Idaho County, which is huge, but also has quite a bit of biomass per unit area, and then Western Oregon and Washington, higher biomass. And then here's the FIA estimates, independently, derived from FIA plot data. And you can see there's some similarities, but it's better to normalize by the different area size of the counties. So here is on the x-axis map biomass, and then on the y, the biomass from FIA. So this is using the PALSAR mask of 2009 to mask out non-forest plots, or to mask in forest plots, however you want to say that. And here's the 2010 one. Not much difference, okay? Tend to get very consistent results, regardless of the biomass of the mask used when you compare like aspatially, like you can in a scatter plot. But they do vary quite a bit locally. Okay, now here is county level forested above ground biomass. This is unfortunate, this thing down here. But anyway, this was mapped biomass versus FIA. So now we've aggregated to the county level, but you can still see this bias. We're actually predicting more biomass than you'd expect on the one-to-one line. And you can zoom into the smaller counties down here, and you see the same trend of over-prediction. It's about 20%. However, if you look at the forested area that is being classified as forest by PALSAR versus FIA, what they consider forested area, we're a lot closer to the one-to-one line. So I'm not convinced that the mask is the problem. And yeah, zooming in down there. pretty good correspondence to the 1-to-1 line, indicative of no bias. So here is the 2016 map using the 2010 PALSAR mask, and I'm just going to toggle between this one and the next one, which is the 2009 mask, and you'll see how it changes. Whoops. Oh, whoops. Go back and forth. So the mask you use does matter locally, but then when you aggregate to the county level and compare across the whole region, they tend to average out those differences. And I don't know how to predict what kind of factors might be contributing to those local variations with PALSAR. I think it's more than just disturbance because, whoops, that's quite a bit of change. But what's nice about PALSAR, because it's radar derived, it doesn't suffer from like classifying ag areas as forest because they're really green. Okay, and here's a map level validation. So because I know the secret locations, I could pull from our maps the predictions and compare it to the actual FI estimates at the plot level. And that's what I'm showing here. But you still see the bias towards overprediction. If you calculate that bias, it's about 12%. But that 12% includes these misclassified pixels over here because the mask isn't perfect. So this is cheating. If I don't cheat and I screen out those pixels, then, well, in the case of using the 2010 PALSAR mask, the bias is up to 29%. Okay, so in terms of the current biomass mapping, these are the conclusions we have from this study. The field plots do efficiently sample the projected landscapes, the project landscapes imaged with the Lidar. We have enough of those project level data sets that we're capturing the range of structural conditions. And actually, I can argue it does a better job because with the stratified random sampling designs, you do a better job of getting the higher biomass conditions that are rare, like old growth, that FIA will tend to miss with a systematic design. We have, with the two papers, which I didn't get into details because I don't have time, but we've established that, yes, you can transfer these predictions across space and time. So that sort of justifies our living database approach. It's the mask you use that has the most influence on the county level AGB estimates. But then when you zoom out to the whole region, they tend to have very similar bias statistics. Overall, we seem to be overestimated by about 20%. And I'm happy to come here to give a talk like this to smart people like you to help me think through why we might be overpredicting. We're still scratching our heads about it. We have some ideas I'm not going to get into, but I'd like to hear your ideas too. But an advantage of using like the climate metrics, which probably has something to do with the overprediction, is that we've broken through that barrier of spectral saturation. We're getting estimates above 450 micrograms per hectare. So that's pretty cool. And one thing we're claiming is that, okay, these may be biased predictions, but we can calculate the biases for a given year, for a given county. And you can apply a bias correction if you want. If you want to adjust your estimate when you download and use these maps. So we're publishing the biases as well. Okay, let's move on to the projections now. What, how much time do I have?
The clock is about 25 minutes.
Yeah. Perfect. I'll leave some time for questions. Okay, 100-year projections of forest biomass now under disturbance and climate regimes. So a couple slides of just our methodological approach using the forest vegetation simulator. So FVS can simulate harvest, fire, and insect disturbances and how they affect tree growth and mortality. It's been doing that for many years. More recently, maybe 5 years ago now, climate FVS was developed by Nick Crookston, so you can also look at a variable climate and its effect on forest growth and mortality. So we can use our living database to inform that. And we actually started by doing that, but then we're like, well, wait a minute. We're doing projections. We don't know where the disturbances are going to happen. We can't really generate maps in the future. We should be using the FIA data for this application because they are an unbiased sample. So we are now. We're using FIA and we're extracting the disturbance probabilities from the FIA plot data. And we are getting climate scenarios sort of from an ensemble of GCM outputs. Okay, so the FIA plots between the years 2000 and 2016, that's what we're using for our simulations. The disturbance rates and the type of disturbance, this comes from the FES data. Should say FIA database for the study area, which we imported into FES. And about half of those FIA plots have actually been remeasured. In the West, it's not so frequent that they go out and remeasure the plots as in the East. It's every 10 years, but it's actually taken them a while to get up to speed out in the West. We do 10% per year. So there's a little bit of a lag. There's quite a bit of variability even in the FIA data. And so we're doing an FIA run with FES 10 times under current climate and 10 times under future climate. So that's the strategy. So results. First, I want to point out that this is a very diverse region. There's quite a few different FES variants. So this is a national map of the FES variants out there, and you can see how complex it is in our study region. But that's a good thing because it's taken into account the different growing conditions in those areas. And if you look at those FES variants, we're pulling out like a probability of disturbance from the plot data from those. So that's what we're using to model our disturbance trajectories for different disturbances. And we're focusing on the FIA data from the National Forest for a paper we're working on. There's actually about, I think, 25 different national forests in the study region. We started off using these 4, and now we're using these 4 for the paper. I apologize, I don't have a map prepared for this talk to show you where these are, but the Payette Forest is actually just north of the Boise up here, and the Ochoco is over this way from the Fremont we have the Sayusla on the coast, and then we switch from the Olympic National Forest up there to the Gifford-Pinchot down in here. But from the FIA data, we have these probabilities of disturbance for these different forests. The Gifford-Pinchot is most affected by stress from mostly bark beetles. Sayusla, there's some of that, but quite a bit more harvest activity and no fire. Pretty wet. The Payette, it's mostly fire dominated. And I think the reason we switched to Payette from the Boise was there's just more FIA plot data FIA plots that have been recently remeasured and that haven't burned up. I think over half the Boise is already burned in the last 20 years. And the Ochoco has a lot of beetle activity. So by choosing those 4, we can kind of look at the different disturbance dynamics that represent the region. Yeah. So here's for the Gifford-Pinchot 100-year simulations. The top 3 graphs show the relative intensity of harvest versus fire versus stress, which is mostly beetles for this forest. And then the bottom, the main figure, the blue shows the current conditions trajectory for climate, And the red is when you project a future climate. And so there's a lot of mortality predicted from climate change. That's why it drops down so precipitously. And it's looking very similar for these other forests across very different conditions. Here's the Sayusla, where there's no fire disturbance to speak of. There's harvest and there's beetle, but you see the same trajectory for current versus future climate. And remember, so the shaded area around the trajectories, that's the 10 runs simulations. This is not saying anything about the uncertainty with the GCM scenarios, all right? So I don't want to imply that we know what that certainty 100 years from now, that's only going to be this much. All right, we know that blows up like a trumpet or a trombone or something just due to the GCM uncertainty. But still, that's such a huge divergence. We're forecasting lots of mortality. Here is the Payette. We have relatively the most fire, but you see the same pattern below, and then finally the Ochiko. So the climate influence is overriding whatever the disturbances are. It's an overwhelming climate effect of climate change. And then I also wanted to comment on these little, it crashes, but then it starts to come up a little bit sometimes. This might be the best example. I think a lot of trees die, but then you get regen. So we think that's what's going on here. After this many years, you start to see more biomass carbon accumulating from the regen. So you get a little bit of a recovery. So maybe if you were to do this for several hundred more years, you might see some oscillation that dampens out. Yeah.
Does FPS climate take into account CO2 fertilization at all?
It's not a physiological model.
Okay.
It's an empirical model. So it's fitted based on growth functions for these different.
So you can't say that because concentrations are twice as much as they were, that's why it's getting some recovery, because even though there's less trees, they're growing faster.
No, there's been other people who have linked FES to process-based models. We're not doing that here. Yeah, good question. And so another way to depict this is it's interesting to look at the contrast between public and private land. So here's a map of land ownership in my home state now. A lot of federal Forest Service land in green, but then you got purple or lavender tribal lands, you've got blue state lands, you've got orange corporate forest lands. And you can also calculate these disturbance trajectories from the land trender time series, which we've done to capture disturbance rates. And it's interesting how much more disturbance there is on the private and corporate lands, like by this dashed line, and the lowest from the federal lands, where there's the least amount of harvesting activity going on. So if you summarize that by the three driving disturbances, it's just a huge contrast between public and private lands. Most of the harvest activity is going on those commercial industrial forest lands or on state lands. Or I shouldn't say state, just the private. But on public lands, which even include the state lands that do get harvested quite a bit, on the public lands, more beetle, more fire. So how does that, and just summarizing overall, it's about an equal distribution of these three disturbances. So here's another way to look at these projections. So on the top is the current climate scenario without climate change. And the red line is private lands, the blue is public lands. And you can see that the private lands are more productive because they're managed to be that way. The second graph below that is The only difference is instituting height caps on the growth, and that's just an artifact of the model. I mean, the trees don't grow infinitely. So you fix that, but it doesn't really change the projections much. The third one is when you incorporate the disturbance trajectories, but without climate. And then the one at the bottom is when you have disturbance and climate incorporated. And you can see how productivity now is really flattened. But it's the private lands that are actually a bit more productive by these projections. And one other way to summarize these data, these are county level summaries now of the growth projections under the climate change scenario. And the counties are Idaho counties on the y-axis, and I've sorted them basically wet to dry, which corresponds north to south. So the counties at the top tend to be northern Idaho, the counties at the bottom tend to be southern. And this shows winners and losers. Northern Idaho may actually benefit from climate change in terms of productivity. But most of Idaho, because most of Idaho is dry, is gonna see decreasing productivity. They're gonna be losers. And that's true whether you're public or private. So yeah, the ecosystem you're in has more influence on your trajectories than ownership, even though ownership matters a lot. Okay, so then in conclusion, these harvest disturbances we found are much more prevalent on the managed state, local, and private lands. You see a lot more fire and insect effects on the federal public lands, mostly Forest Service. So this is some evidence that, you know, for forest management, if you want to manage to sequester carbon, then the hands-off approach, probably not the way to go. And then the higher tree mortality due to projected climate change. This is what's really driving down the carbon sequestration potential. There's a lot of trees dying out there, and I'm even seeing that in the field. All right. That's what I have for you today. Thanks very much, and I want to acknowledge other people on this project team that have helped with all this work. It's been a big project, but a good one.
Questions for Andy? Cool.
I have some. So nerdy detail stuff, but why not? Since nobody else is asking more thoughtful, profound questions for now. But with the plot data you were mentioning, you split them out. You saved the FIA for the validation, but use these contributing plots for calibration.
Mm-hmm.
I got at least one pro versus con was the not secret location issue.
Right.
Of the contributed ones. But what else about was there any other differences about the contributed plots that were pro or con versus the FIA in terms of how they were measured, or there's arranged?
I mentioned one other pro, and that's with the stratified random sampling designs, you do a better job of getting the higher biomass conditions. So you can do that at the project level scale within a Lidar collection, but then it also translates at the regional level into a higher proportion of higher biomass plots. So it's a more efficient sample for what you're trying to achieve. With FIA, you get, even though there's so many more plots, you get you know, a lot more falling in the middle of the conditions out there.
And how about plot by plot individually? Were the contributed ones like a mishmash of fixed radius, variable rate, and all that?
We're not using variable radius.
Okay,
Yeah. That's just too difficult. We're having to, you know, we want to define plot footprint for binning our LiDAR data, because with our reference database, the bin LiDAR and the metrics we extract from that are just as important as the aggregated tree, the area-based estimates, but our structural variables. And we're doing biomass here, but we've also, you know, generated the volume, basal area, those kind of more standard forestry structural attributes. stand structure attributes. So we can model that too. And actually we have in consideration of some of these stakeholders. A lot of the forest managers, especially national forest managers, are not interested in biomass just yet. They're not thinking about carbon sequestration or managing for that. I mean, I think it's coming. That's not their immediate need.
So when you're producing these maps at landscape scale, so based on the LiDAR, like cell size?
We're doing 30 meters only because that aligns with the Landsat.
And that's what you're doing for the Landsat.
Yeah.
Regional stuff.
Yeah, and we're trying to bin the LiDAR points to the Landsat pixel footprints from the time series so that we minimize any kind of resampling. Well, we don't want to resample the Landsat to match the LiDAR. We want to bin the LiDAR to match the Landsat. But we haven't been successful at that everywhere. Like in Oregon, there's all these different projections. And there's not actually projection, like with last tools or whatever, not all those different projections have a, what's the word, transformation. There's not always a transformation for every one of those. Because you should reproject the point cloud before you then bin them and generate your metrics. So.
Did you have a mishmash of point clouds too, as far as when they were flown and what different pulse densities and?
Oh yeah, thank you. Yes, so all those LiDAR collections. So the earliest I think we're using is maybe 2002, and then we're going right through 2016. So we are, when we're linking that, when we're training the Landsat model, for whatever year the LiDAR was flown, that's the Landsat pixels that we're training for that particular year, so that we're matching in time. So this question came up in talking with grad students earlier. So I didn't show the regional map based on only LiDAR, which is discontinuous, but it's also a whole range of different years that it was mapped. So yeah, that would be a source of error. So we've been careful to only use Landsat pixels from the same year the LiDAR was acquired. And in building the LiDAR derived maps, we're using projects where the LiDAR, where the plot data were collected within 2 years of the LiDAR being flown. Yeah. That's you. I think you were next.
Yeah, I'm just curious. So in the first part of your talk, when you predict biomass from FIA plots or your contributive plots, that relies heavily on the allometric equations. Do you folks have allometric equations you trust out there?
Right. We are using the FIA's component ratio method now. And there's really good work out there showing how important those allometric relationships, how much that affects your estimates. Lord Duncanson has gotten some stuff out. So we haven't been looking at that at all. But there's other good work that does look at that. Yeah, but we settle on the component ratio method as probably, because FIA is using it, and because we're kind of from the get-go assuming them as our unbiased sample, we're going with what FIA is using. Yeah. Yes.
So I'm wondering if you guys have any strategy for like assimilation of new data. You're talking about like building up of these databases, right? So do you have, let's say, I mean, just for an example, like a Bayesian framework type thing where you're estimating some parameters and projecting into the future, and then you're like getting new data in, and so updating your knowledge and going on and on.
Yeah. So good question. So we're not doing anything Bayesian. We are adding more reference data as we get it to this. That's why I call it a living database. So you could say that the reference data in there are timeless. It doesn't matter when the trees are measured and the LiDAR are flown. At the scale that we are relating them with the area-based method, I'm confident that even with the older 2002 LiDAR collections that were lower density, at the scale of a 400 meter forest, 400 meter squared forest inventory plot, you still get a stable height distribution. And so that, in my thinking, is a minor source of air and noise compared to other things that are going on. Now, it would be interesting if this would be a good data set to try something like that. I don't think I'm smart enough to do that, or I'm not making it a priority, but it would. I'm hoping to make that available publicly so other people can do that. Can't do everything. Yeah. Yep.
So kind of coming back to Dan's question, are the FIA plots are the radii too small essentially to scale up to Landsat? Is that one of the reasons in the gridding issue and not?
Okay, yeah, thanks for saying that. That is one issue.
Okay.
The small plot difference is another issue. And then another one is how you deal with the fact you've got 4 subplots. Because if you treat them as independent plots, that would be pseudo-replication because they're autocorrelated. So the best way to do it would be to sort of nest them in like maybe a mixed effects model or something. That would be pretty cool. And that's something I'm actually more interested in trying because I just understand that a little better. The strategy that we've done, even though we're not using it in this project, is just to take the point cloud clips from the 4 subplots and concatenate them. Pretend it's a single larger plot and do the same with the tree measures. And so they represent the same place on the ground and fit into the reference database as a plot level estimate.
What size fixed radius plots are you guys using?
Well, that does vary a little bit.
Okay.
We don't require that they have the same. Most are 400 meters square, but some are. Let's see, what is that? A 0.04 hectare. Some are like as small as half that size, and others are. So that's like a 10th acre, and we've got some 5th acre plots in there that are bigger, but we also have some 20th acre, I guess. I think that's as small as we go. Yeah. And then that size is more comparable to the FIA plot. Yeah, or subplot. Yeah.
There's back to the living database, and you touched upon a little bit about how there's such a wide variety of different LiDAR collects and parameters and sensors. Have you noticed impacts of pooling those different types of LiDAR data set, particularly like some of your transferability work you've been doing?
Well, you might notice the spatial transferability one took us longer to get published. Some of those issues came up because there were differences in the LiDAR collects between those different collections, because a couple of larger landscapes were less dense, but also one of them had bigger scan angles. One of them that we actually eventually threw out to replace with another had the small plots. So that's not an issue with the LiDAR, but became an issue with, different plot sizes. So we threw that one out, and it was the 20th acre plots. So the reviewer was worried about that. And I think at 20th acre, it wasn't low density LiDAR, so I honestly don't think it was a big deal. But the combination of a small plot with, if it had been low density LiDAR, I think then you are starting to get some unstable height distributions. But we haven't really dug into, trying to isolate the scan angle effects or other sources of variation between the collects. There's literature out there that's looked at that. I think when you're doing especially individual tree-based sort of approaches, But at the plot scale, and especially when you're essentially predicting a 30-meter resolution, I just think those issues don't matter anymore at that big of a bin size.
Any other questions for Andy? Okay, just a real quick announcement. We've got 2 more Wheatland seminars coming up for the semester. April 3rd, Justin Swowern from the Maine Natural Areas program will be here talking about vernal pool mapping with some remote sensing techniques that he's been using. And then on the 17th of April, still waiting on some final confirmation on this, but we're expecting Phil Townsend, professor in the Department of Forest and Wildlife Ecology, University of Wisconsin-Madison. And those announcements will be coming out over the next couple of weeks. Thanks, everyone, and thank you very much, Andy.
Those have been good questions.
Oh, and we'll be at Tim's tap room.
Speaking of questions, that's one I get really good.